Hey guys, so 37 will be coming to Reverse 999 and let's review her kit. First of all, I want to mention she is a DPS carry unit, she is not a support unit. She only has 10% party buff to the entire party, so she is not a support unit, it's just 10%. She is very similar to a lot of other carries. She is very AP hungry if you want to maximize her damage. And mainly her kit revolves around two things, which is a follow-up AoE attack and Genesis damage. So to start it off, let's talk about her insight. At insight 1, she gained the ability to do a follow-up attack, which is called supplementary formula, and she does it every time she has 5 stacks of Eureka. Every time she take an action, she get 1 stack of Eureka. If she use ultimate, she get another 2 stack of Eureka. But we will talk about that when we are talking about her ultimate. At Insight 2, when she enter the battle, she get additional critical damage by 15%. And at Insight 3, it allows her Genesis damage to crit. Which means if she does not have Insight 3, her Genesis damage will not crit. So her Insight 2 giving crit damage will not be applied on her Genesis damage, which makes her a pretty lackluster DPS unit. So unless you invest until Insight 3, which of course we will, then she will be a decent DPS unit. So for her ultimate is a mass buff, and it gives all allies 2 stack of numeral perception and gain 2 stack of enlightenment, and add 2 Eureka to herself. And when she uses her ultimate, there is 1 action that she's taking, so it grants 1 Eureka, so additional of 2. Total, when using her ultimate, we get up to 3 stack of Eureka. So if she already have 2 or 3 stack of Eureka when you use her ultimate, it would instantly trigger her follow-up attack. The key factor here to make her a better DPS is to optimize or basically effectively use enlightenment buff. Enlightenment buff grants her 100% of additional damage, and depending on if she's doing a single target, AoE, it really does affect her damage output, because if we use a single target attack, that 100% additional will be on one enemy, so we are kind of like wasting the enlightenment buff. If we use it on an AoE attack, like her follow-up attack, which deals damage to all the enemy, if there's 3 enemy, that is additional 300%. And if you are using her second incantation, curve mapping, that is 200% because it deals damage to 2 enemies. So her first incantation is triangulation and 140% mental damage, which with 40% Genesis damage to 1 enemy. So when you use triangulation, you gain just 1 stack of Eureka, alright? And that is because she's taking an action. So this ability doesn't exactly grant an additional stack of Eureka. So do note that every time you use her incantation or any of her skills, you get 1 stack of Eureka. Curve mapping, 1 stack. Triangulation, 1 stack. The thing here to note is that her kit basically revolves around Genesis damage. So when you use triangulation, you deal additional 40% Genesis damage. So what exactly is Genesis damage? I will explain it a little bit later, but Genesis damage basically bypass all defense, which means it hits harder than the normal mental and reality damage, because the enemies or the boss, they do not have defense against Genesis damage. And if we compare the other DPS unit, their incantation deals roughly about the same percentage as 37. So total here would be 140 plus 40 Genesis, 180. A lot of unit will also do 180, and at 3 star they will also do about 450% damage to a single target unit. But 37 having that Genesis actually out damage them in terms of using incantation. So let's say if you are using like Sonata Psycube, after you use her ultimate, then you use her incantation, so technically you can boost up 37's damage a little bit more. So for our second incantation, curve mapping. So curve mapping deals damage to 2 enemies, 70% mental and 40% Genesis damage. So when we add that together, it's about 220%. And most of the AoE units incantation also deal about that percentage. So again, she doing Genesis means she deal slightly more damage compared to the other incantations of other characters. The thing here is that even though she has the utility to provide sturdiness buff, but it's only towards herself. So if again it is not a party buff, which again I highlight that she is not a support DPS unit, but a DPS carry unit. So about her playstyle, the first point I have mentioned it already, and the key factor to maximize her damage is using her ultimate, basically using enlightenment buff effectively. So here I made out the math. 37 is all about math anyway. So 300% Genesis extra damage when she uses a follow-up attack after she uses her ultimate due to enlightenment buff. And if you use curve mapping right after her ultimate, then there's there is damage to 2 enemies, so additional 200% Genesis attack. So that makes her ultimate actually pretty strong. So here I did a comparison with other characters like Jessica, A-Knight, Centurion. Their ultimate is also AoE. Jessica does about 350% AoE damage, but she also has Genesis in terms of a poison, but her Genesis cannot crit. A-Knight 400%, Centurion 300, so overall they are doing about 1000%. So 37, which her follow-up attack is 120% mental with 40% Genesis. So if against 3 enemies, that would be 360% mental and 120% Genesis. But now there's additional 500% because her follow-up attack deal damage to 3 enemies, which is 300, and additional 200 if you use curve mapping. So we get overall 620% Genesis damage. At this point, I'm not exactly 100% sure, but I do notice that the Genesis damage part is the one that increased after she used her ultimate. So I do believe that the additional damage from her ultimate, from enlightenment buff, is Genesis. So if we add them together, she deals about 1000% as well, but 600% of that is Genesis damage. Again, Genesis hit harder than the other type of damage. So how much harder? So here I took the reverse 99 calculator and I did some calculation, assuming that the enemy has about 600 defense, mental and reality. So when we use Genesis damage, we basically bypass that 600 defense, and if we put it that way, 10% Genesis damage is actually equivalent to 27% of mental or reality damage, which is actually quite substantial. However, this will be less effective if the enemy has lower defense, or if you bring a character that reduces the enemy's defense. So I was testing it with Shemaine and Become Blum. When I use their debuff that reduces enemy's defense, then I noticed that 10% of Genesis damage is equivalent to just about 17% of mental or reality damage. So 37's potential really comes in, especially if you are fighting against enemy with high defense. Then you can make use of that Genesis damage to deal even more damage. Now, for other follow-up attacker, because there's the discussion about, 37 is very good with Lilia, possibly making her bypassing some of the AoE new Babbles, because they do follow-up attack, and every follow-up attack that other characters do will generate 1 Eureka for 37. But let's just put it into this scenario. Now if we have Lilia in the party, so you have 2 carry in the party, who will you use to basically use all the incantation and build up the Moxie? So for example, in this case, if you really want to trigger Lilia's follow attack in order to build up 37's Eureka, I'm assuming that Lilia will be the main DPS unit. So in that case, 37 will not be able to generate Moxie quickly because Lilia will be using most of the incantation, taking up all the AP. So in that case, if Lilia did manage to trigger 37's follow-up attack after 5 Eureka, then it's just the AoE of 120% mental damage and 40% Genesis damage. That is not a lot. And assuming that you have been taking several turns you probably have killed some of the enemy and there's only 1 or 2 enemy left on the field, and you will not be able to deal much damage, which to me doesn't really make much sense. Instead, if you have a character that buffs up, like let's say Pickles, you put Pickles together with 37, and Pickles after her ultimate providing 40% damage boost, and 37 using her own ultimate and trigger follow-up attack will probably deal even more damage than Lilia doing her ultimate and having 37 doing a follow-up attack that is just about 120 plus 40% damage. So in this case, I do not really think that Lilia will be a very good partner or pairing with 37. However, with Ju Niangzi and as well as Pickles, New Bebbles, then the discussion is like different, because New Bebbles, she does follow attack every time an enemy attacks. So if at the start of the turn you have 3 enemies, they are doing 4 attack, and all this 4 attack landed on New Bebbles, she have Taunt anyway, then you already gain 4 stack of Eureka. So 37 will be able to trigger her follow attack so much more frequently that it doesn't really matter that if she's just dealing 120 plus 40%, because with the frequency that she is unleashing her follow-up attack, it kind of makes sense if you want to put them together. And for Ju Niangzi's case, she also does a lot of follow-up attack that you can trigger 37 follow-up attack more frequently. So in that case, if you want to pair her up and make her a secondary DPS unit, then by all means, if you put her with Ju Niangzi or New Bebbles, then it is alright. But I do not really recommend to put her together with Lilia. And one more factor that I want to mention is that if you are playing with fallout attacks, so assuming that you have New Bebbles and New Bebbles has generated her Eureka, maybe let's say to 3 stack, and finally at this point, you have managed to build up 37's Moxie, and now she can use her ultimate. And when you use her ultimate, her stack goes up to 5, but do note that she's supposed to get 3 stack, but because now she's already have 3 stack, so her ultimate are only able to fill up another 2 stack of Eureka, and 1 stack of Eureka will be wasted. So the worst case scenario is you, due to all the follow-up, you build up her Eureka to 4 stack, and now you have her ultimate and you use her ultimate, then you are going to waste 1 stack of it. So in case if that does happen, then use one of her incantation to trigger her follow attack, then only use her ultimate. So if you are lacking a star DPS unit, you can go for 37. Just at P0, her AoE DPS, if you optimize and play around her, she can be as good as other DPS unit. But if you want to use her as a secondary DPS, like having New Bebbles or Ju Niangzi to do all the follow-up attack to generate her Eureka, then you need at least P2, because P2 at least boosts up her damage to 180% mental and 60% Genesis, if I'm not mistaken. Alright, so it does make her hit harder, and that makes more sense because using her as secondary DPS means she probably have very little chance to use her ultimate and to get enlightenment buff. The benefit here is she has the AoE DPS with Genesis damage, and if you really want to add to your roster and you want a Genesis damage attacker that can crit, then you can get her, because I do know that there is the raid, the coming up raid that allowed Genesis attacker to deal more damage. So there will be fights that revolve around Genesis. So if you want a character that can do Genesis damage, then you can get 37. As for team recommendations, so here I have New Bebbles, as I already discussed why, and Ju Niangzi also for the follow-up attack, and Tooth Fairy because 37 does have several crit buff, crit damage up, so if we push on to that factor to make her crit more often, definitely she will deal way more damage than she should. So Tooth Fairy will be the logical sustain to put her together with. Alright, so that's all for my discussion about 37's kit. Good luck to you guys. I have not decided if I want to pull for her yet. I wanted to pull for her initially because I really thought that she's kind of like a support DPS, but knowing now that she's actually a DPS unit, so the thing is that I have Lilia as star DPS, I have Charlie, P4, just need one more and I get it for free in the next event. So my Charlie will be P5. So I kind of have star covered. So the question is, do I really want a Genesis attacker or not? A Genesis attacker that can crit on her Genesis attack. So I have not really decided yet, probably in a few days, since the banner will be in a few days time anyway. But if you are lacking of a star DPS, go for it. She will be useful in raid. So good luck with your pulls.